Museum Digit
2020.
A Magyar Nemzeti Múzeum online
virtuális konferenciája.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. I am Yves Winkin and I'm glad to share a few moments with you here at Museum Digit 2020. Well, I was trained as an anthropologist both in the United States, in Belgium, sure enough, I'm from Belgium, and in Paris. And I would like to apply some kind of an anthropological frame to museums. When I say enchanting museums, or re-enchanting museums, actually, would that mean that in the first place, museums are enchanted islands? Yes, it is. To me, museums are certainly not Disneylands, that's for sure, but they are small islands of peace, so to speak. They are somehow protected islands away from the hurly-burly of everyday life. And if I say re-enchanting museums, that's a way to say that they ought to be somehow protected from the current world. Now, you might also say, if you say re-enchanting, does also mean that they are disenchanted. Yes, they are. I think the situation of museums is difficult all over Europe for, sure enough, sanitary reasons, but also for financial reasons, and also possibly because the public is not there when we are expecting it. Now, when I say re-enchanting the museum, I'm saying that we ought to set up new frames in order to say this is a museum. A frame, in anthropological term, is any device that is going to let you know where you are and what is somehow expected of you. And what I am suggesting when I say re-enchanting museums is that we ought to implement or we ought to reinforce frames which are going to lead our visitors into a reinvented world. That is, the museum is still going to be the museum. There is no physical change, but there is going to be hopefully what I might call a new mindset so that visitors are going to be more comfortable, more enjoying themselves within the time and spatial frame of their visit. Let me give you 3 examples. And that can be very simple, and you might have already used such devices, but you did not just think them in terms of frames. Suppose you open your museum at night. I'm sure that you have done that for quite a few of you already. But the very idea of having a museum open all night, in the dark, that is glowing in the dark, that is exploring rooms with quite a few shadows, possibly going down the basement, possibly going up in the attic, might lead you to believe you are all of a sudden in a totally different world. That's what I call reframing, and that's what I call re-enchanting. Now, let me give you a little extra piece of theory. A British poet of the 18th century, William Coleridge, spoke in a letter to a friend of his of the willing suspension of disbelief. When you are attending a theater, you do want to believe that you are not in a theater anymore. You are in a play, you are in a story, and you are going to make some effort in order to stay within your dream. And I'm alluding to the dream situation because it's somehow similar. You know so much how you can stay within your dream for a few more minutes. Same story when you are in a movie theater. You do know that what you see is just a projection of small bits of light on a screen. At the same time, you're going to be believing for the time of the movie that you are in a story that you're living with the heroes. And same for the theater, and same for the museum. That is, you're going to dive into a different world for a time. It doesn't mean that you are going to be totally illusioned and not being able to learn something, for example. Yes, you are rather going to be in a situation where you are more inclined, more open to new experiences, and therefore more willing to learn new things. That's at least my position. If you put people, and I would say also people, together, that is, if you go alone to a theater, if you go alone to Disneyland, you never know, well, you're not going to believe anything. If you go with your family, if you go with friends, it's going to be much more comfortable to believe together and to adhere to the story which is offered to you. I was giving you the example of the night. Let me give you another example. And I actually discovered that situation in a small Swiss museum where people were invited, it was a train museum, were invited to put clothes, let's say, of travelers of the late 19th century. The kids were invited to put a hat, to put a cap, and to walk around the museum, all dressed up. First, sure enough, the parents were not too comfortable with that idea, and finally they gave up, and finally they dressed up with the cap and hat and boa and whatever they could find in the drawers which were just ready for them. And all of a sudden, it was not a museum anymore. It was more like a train station of the late 19th century. It was all fun. It was some kind of a collective joke. But at the same time, people would then realize that it was not so easy to board a train in the 19th century when you have such hats on your head, when you have such long robes all along your body. And it is as if the playwright or the museum director or whoever designed that stage had been able to guess that when people are opening up emotionally because they are laughing, they are having fun, they are also more often to learn new, not lessons, we are not in school again, but they are ready to learn new information, let's put it that way. Let me give you a third example, which has to do with the fact that museum can also be set up in such a ways that they don't look like museums anymore. They look almost like very fancy hotels, in the sense that the personnel is going to be extraordinarily courteous to every visitor, almost taking them by the hand. And that very polite, over-polite situation is going, once again, to set up a new frame within the museum, as if the overall environment was saying, this is not a museum, this is a palace, but why wouldn't the museum be some kind of a palace for a while? You are our most desired people, you visitors, and we are going to treat you like very privileged people, like VIPs, very important persons. What I'm saying is that you don't need a lot of money, you don't need a lot of staging in order to set up new frames. And those frames might be abandoned as quickly as they were assembled. You don't need to set them up for weeks or months like exhibitions. They can have the duration of a weekend or of an event, if not an evening. But at least they're going to give you visitors, and I would say you staff, some kind of an extra shot of the possibilities are offered by museums. Let me give you a final example, which is derived from an exhibition I organized at the Musée des Arts et Métiers, where I was a director for 4 years, from 2015 to 2018. The idea was suggested to me by a graphic artist called Françoise Skyten. And Françoise Skyten is both a very well-known personality in the world of graphic design with beautiful albums, but is also known for creating rather spectacular exhibitions and even created a museum called Train World in Brussels. His idea is that an exhibition or a museum has to be very much staged, and people have to be immersed in a story. But it doesn't mean that once you are immersed in a story, you cannot learn and adhere to new ideas. The idea was to pick up in the attic, in the storage rooms of the museums, different objects that help designers to design perspectives. And he went and selected the object and staged them all. He also showed how a few key objects of our museums were very important in his albums. That is, you can find almost the same object in his album and in reality. And within the exhibition, both the imaginary object and the real object were confronting each other. There was music, there were a lot of light, that is, there was all kind of theatrical devices, so we were totally, I would say, engulfed in the story. At the same time, he would bet on the capacity for children to invite their parents to go to the final room and draw with them. That is, there were small school benches, and visitors, both children and adults, were invited to go and sit, take a sheet of paper, a pencil that was offered to them all, and they would design, they would draw. Sure, the adults would tend to believe they cannot draw anymore. Ultimately, they would. And all those drawings, and after a few weeks, surely enough, after a few months, there were hundreds, if not thousands of them, were sometimes stunning. That is, people had a capacity to become drawing persons again, as if they were able to tap into their childhood experience and be able to draw with their kids. It was a rather amazing experience, and it was amazing because it stressed the accuracy of that idea. If we do things together, we do them probably much better, some kind of a collective intelligence. So what I'm saying is that in Françoise Skyten experiments, exhibition, but that's also an experiment, we were involved in his album, so to speak. But at the same time, we learned things. We rediscovered a capacity to draw. And we rediscovered that there was a direct relationship between generations, in the sense that the kids were our teachers, we, the adults. They were the one inducing us to jump over and dare go to the bench, so to speak, and start drawing. So, to sum up, re-enchanting a museum is made of tiny devices, which I call frames. And the frames are ways of saying this is a museum, that is not a school, that is not a Disney World, there's something different, and we are going to show you that you can be both comfortable and having fun and learn something all together, all at the same time. I have been using the term ritual for naming such collective operations. Rituals are ways of almost touching, let's say, the blue sky. Let's say the island, the ideal island. Rituals are ways of breaching the sort of envelope that wraps up in some kind of a world which seems to us quite blocked and unbreakable. And rituals sort of break the envelope, the veil, and let us reach and touch for a while, a short while, a different world. What I'm saying is that museums can be the situation, can be the platform from which we can reach for a while some kind of an utopian world. And we do it with some hesitation. We cannot quite believe we do it, but it does happen. It does happen when we are at night in a museum. It seems totally unreal. It does happen when we are all dressed up in a museum and we just don't know who we are anymore and where we are anymore. It looks like we are in the 19th century for a while, and that's very much fun, and we are learning a lot of stuff at the same time. So there are many ways of inventing rituals. There are many ways of re-enchanting the museums, and I would say it can be done also with digital devices. I mean, VR is certainly a way to create a different reality for a while, except that in many cases it is very expensive, you know that. It is also a way of immersing ourselves so much with that so that we might be panicked, you know that also. And what I'm saying is that we can sometimes use much simpler devices in order to reach the same goals. So, my time is over. I wish you a most pleasant conference, a most creative conference, and I wish at some point I get the chance to come and visit. I'm not saying hint, hint here, but it's almost that I would very much like to discover at some point Hungarian museums and get the chance to talk to you. Well, enjoy the conference again, and hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.